Everybody, I'll officially call our school building committee meeting to order. It is 6:01 on November 3rd. So thank you all for joining us again. So we'll just get right into the nitty-gritty of the agenda. I don't think we have any public comment, if I'm not mistaken, Miss Linville. No? Okay, great. We're gonna just jump right in and start discussing the designer applications. As you guys all saw, the packet from Margaret last Friday. She sent us a ton of information and then a nice little graph or synopsis of what we should be focusing in on as we look through that. So I'm gonna turn this over to Margaret. It's all you.
All righty. So there's two things I want to do tonight. I want to sort of turn the pages of some of the proposals, hear your thoughts, look back at the questions that we drafted last week. But I also today put together a little tutorial on how to think about designer fees, because I think, part of what's important here is to use this as an opportunity to understand how the fees are as a percentage of the larger project. I don't necessarily want to start with the fees because it's really, my big takeaway from this is the fees are a piece of this. It's really about finding the best partner for you. But I do want to spend a little time on that. So I think we could do this a couple of different ways. I know that hopefully most of you had a chance to look at them. I think that it might be ideal to just sort of go around the room and hear people's comments about them, about the proposals, unless it's helpful to actually turn the pages, because I'm happy to do that.
Margaret, one sec. Erin, Camellia is on as an attendee. Can we get her in as a panelist?
So she's actually signed in twice. She is on as a panelist too.
Oh, okay.
But do you want to quick introduce her?
Yeah, if I can see her.
Well,
Camellia,
her camera's off.
Oh, the camera's off.
Oh, she's trying to come on.
There she is.
Yay.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to introduce our newest member, Camellia, who lives on South Summer Street down in South Holyoke, and she has children that goes to Peck Middle, Camellia? Peck Middle. So she'll be, she's the newest member of our group, so I just wanted to welcome her.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thanks for joining us.
And Camellia, anytime you have a question about anything,
Thank you.
raise your hand, say, and you can talk in Spanish freely. You don't have to, worry about your English so much. And if there's any questions, always feel free to jump right in, okay? Sorry, Margaret. Go ahead.
No worries. Would it be helpful if I pulled up the comparison of the applications first, just to kind of ground us in what we're looking at? Why don't we start with that? Okay. And that might give anybody who hasn't had a chance to look at the applications an opportunity. I will tell you, I've got so much stuff open on my desktop right now to share with you. I hope I don't pull up the wrong thing, but let me pull up what I had shared in my email. Okay, so people see this? So I had just pasted this into my email, but it was an effort to kind of ground the proposals in some basic facts as opposed to opinions about who these folks are. So there's essentially three firms that we're considering. Jones Whitsett, who were the architects for the prior project that started in 2017 and who went through a designer selection process then, and the committee then selected them. So they have done a design for the Peck site, which is what they're going to be presenting to us as part of the interviews next week. Then there is a firm called Flansburgh, who are based in Boston. They've been around quite a long time, almost 60 years. They've done a lot of MSBA funded schools, including middle schools, although the schools that we are looking at are not middle schools because their middle schools are not in the model school program. So kind of silly, but they have a couple of experienced people on the job, and they are working with an engineering firm and I bring this up because the engineering is kind of from scratch on the model schools for reasons that we'll talk about. So I thought it was useful to look back at who those folks were. Flansburgh had 2 schools in the model school program. They actually submitted a package for each of them. However, they are going to come to, at my request, they're going to come to the interview and talk about, they think that one of these projects is a better fit than the other for this project. So they'll be talking briefly about both of them in the interview, but really presenting on one. And then Mount Vernon Group, also a firm that's been around a long time, based in Wakefield, very experienced people on the project. Also have done some middle and high schools. The school that they're going to be talking about is a school that was built once in New York State and then once in Athol. It's the Lincoln Elementary School. So that's their model school. And then just to go back to Jones Whitsett, they're in Greenfield. They've also done middle schools. The partners who are working on this are folks you might remember if you followed the previous project, Dory Brooks and Christian Whitsett. And they are a little bit younger firm, but still 38 years, they've been around. So that's just a little bit about each firm. So do people feel comfortable? Because what we could do here is to go through the 3 packages, and I would actually suggest starting with Flansburgh and Mount Vernon Group and coming back to Jones Whitsett. Do people have comments or thoughts about what they saw in the packages that will lead us sort of further towards what the questions we want to ask? Because that's really the focus of the call of this meeting today, is to finally set what the questions will be for the interviews, which will be 2 weeks from tonight on the 17th. Each interview, I would recommend, be somewhere between 50 and 55 minutes long. As we discussed last week, we'll give them a set of questions we want them to make a brief presentation on, and then there'll be a Q&A session.
I have a general question before we get into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely.
So I guess I still can't fully wrap my head around the whole model school, not model school thing, because the Jones Whitsett project is not a model school. The other 2 firms have other schools that might work for us, but they're not model schools, so they couldn't submit them. So how is it that we're interviewing Jones Whitsett with a not model school, which was our previous design? If we choose that, are we doing a model school project, or is this just here for comparison? I guess I don't understand why it's being presented together, because I feel like if we go, like I said, if we go that way, it's not a model school. So then are we in the model school program or not?
So I would say it's unusual. I would say it's a hybrid, right? Typically communities come to the model school process because they are looking for something, I guess I would say, faster than the normal. The MSBA does ask communities in general to look at the model schools as part of their designer selection process and consider whether any of the model schools are appropriate. So that happened the first time around, and partly because we were looking at schools on 2 different sites, there really wasn't one. Also, many of the model schools, and this is a feature of, the drawings that you probably saw, are mostly designed for there's lower buildings designed for larger sites. You're a city, these projects are typically not as tall, the ones that are in the model school. However, I talked to a designer earlier this week who has a high school design that's in the model school portfolio. They've actually built it 3 different times in 3 different communities, and it's been 2 stories, 3 stories, and 4 stories, depending on the site. So the design can be adapted. The question is whether there's anything of value that's in these designs that you want to, if you want to use Jones Whitsett, is there something in the other designs that you hear or see that you want to sort of bring into the process? Or is there one of the model schools that seems like a better fit for whatever reason? So as I said last week, it's partly, I would take it as a committee member as an opportunity to kind of educate yourself by looking at other things and understanding the value of what it is you ultimately choose as a group. But
it is
it's a
not
little weird.
part of the model school program, right? Like, we're basically looking at what we had, comparing it and using it as a comparison opportunity to see if one of these would also fit us. So if we end up going with one of those 2 architectural firms, then it's a model school project. But if we ultimately end up deciding to go with Jones Whitsett, then it's not a model school project. I guess I just wanted to get that clarification out there.
Yeah.
Because I know if I was slightly confused, I'm probably not the only one.
No, well, and there are a couple of ways in which the execution of the model school would look different. And there are sort of, because I'm going to talk about this a little bit in my fee presentation, but the way I would think about it is there's a significant amount of design that is done as part of the model school that it will be reused. There's a significant part that has to be redone, but in the phases of the design, the detailed development of design, there is somewhat less work and therefore somewhat less time. So for instance, if you were a community that was like, we need a school yesterday, which, everybody feels that way, but in some communities, it's like a bigger issue than others. The model school process is very helpful because if you're willing to make only minor modifications to the model school, you're able to, you have a site that looks like the site it was built on and you're only making minor modifications, you can move very quickly into an estimate, an agreement with the MSBA for a cost, and you will have a shorter design period. If Jones Whitsett is selected here, the design period will be longer. So because they need to detail the design of this to the full extent that allows it to be built.
Even though their design was already done?
Well, so maybe we should talk about the fee thing a little bit because the explanation for the question you're asking is a little bit embedded in one of the slides. The design is not far from done. So what they did is the first stage, so it's so-called schematic design. Let me see if I can open up my presentation here.
Mark, did you have a question before we get further? I know your hand was up, but it's back down.
Not so much well, I guess I do have a question, but it might be a long one. So I don't know if
By all means.
Go for it.
So the original design was centered around I don't know, programming that the Holyoke Public Schools wanted to have for their community. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the architects coming in as part of the model schools in 2 weeks, will they have to kind of talk and prove how their model school design will incorporate the programming that we.
Yeah.
Okay. I
Yeah.
guess it wasn't that long.
Yeah, so let me pull up the slide. I wanted to say it's out of context for my overall thoughts about the fees. So, maybe let me just go back to the beginning, because I think this might help some of the questions that are coming up. So this is Margaret's little tutorial about fees. And it's going to get to in the third or fourth slide, it's going to explain the answers to these questions. So design fees are a component of the total project cost. So this slide explains that, and what I did to do these diagrams, by the way, is I went back to the previous PEC budget to develop these numbers. And I'm very proud of myself because I learned how to make pie charts today, which I didn't know how to do. So lots of pie charts coming up. So here's the designer fee, 8% as a total. And project cost includes, a whole bunch of things. Construction costs, which is the big one, other fees, contingencies, furniture, and technology. So just to understand that what we're talking about here with the designer selection is just that first piece.
What are other pieces?
Can I get the slide?
Okay.
Come on. Okay. So this is important to understand too, that when you are looking at that orange slice, right, there are a whole bunch of people involved, right? So if you looked at the designer applications, you saw that each of them has a page with like 20 little boxes on it, right? That's all the other people working on the project. And this diagram, again, I went back to what the fees were for the previous project because they're a good model for the sort of typical. So the architect's share is about half, or in this case, a little bit more than half. There's a civil engineer who has a big piece of the fee. So that's utilities, grading, parking, blah, blah, blah. Landscape, which is all the stuff you walk on, you see the playgrounds. Then there's the building systems, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection. There's a structural engineer. And then there's a whole raft of others, which is kitchen, code, cost estimating, who all have like 0.5% or 1%, right? So I just put them all in a bucket. So that's important to understand, that when we're talking about fees and the work, it's not just the work of the architect. Like, all of these people have work to do as part of the project. So I'm going to come back to this one, but just to explain to Mark and Aaron's questions. So, and I meant to put a line, but essentially in the overall schedule for a project, there are these different phases, and you're going to hear these come up again and again. So there's what's called feasibility, which is behind us. So feasibility is creating an educational program, looking at options for a site, and selecting a site. So that is done, right? We're not going to revisit that. So you could think of this as having a line right here that's like, now we're here. We're picking a designer to do schematic design. So the schematic design is different in this case for Jones Whitsett than it is for the model schools. Jones Whitsett does not have a lot of work to do if they're selected. They have to update their drawings with some changes the MSBA has made to the science lab requirements, and they're probably going to want to revisit the program with the designers, and we may look at other options for cost savings. They don't have a lot of work to do. The model school designer, by comparison, has a lot of work to do because they have to redesign the site, they have to redesign the building systems to a level that can be the basis of an estimate, a cost estimate that can be a funding agreement with the MSBA. So right here on this line, this is where the funding agreement gets signed. Then there's usually about 6 months of what's called design development, which is developing the design to another level of design, which is sort of a typical marker. And then construction documents, which is creating the bid documents, and then there's bidding, and then there's construction. So the pieces that are the same, whether you're doing a model school or a not model school, are the bidding and construction, right? If you have a project of a certain size, it's the same, right? What's different is in the Jones Whitsitt version, the schematic design piece is shorter, but the design development and construction pieces are longer. For the model school, the schematic piece is longer, probably longer, and design development and construction documents are shorter. So overall, there's probably a little bit of less time for the model school, but the fees, you can see like some pieces are shorter, some pieces are longer. And we'll come back to this. This is sort of a more detailed description of, how to think about what that reimbursement looks like. But that's, hopefully that helps answer, like they've done, I would say 3% of the 50% of the job, which is the design.
That's wonderful clarity. I really appreciate that. That's a great slide.
So I want to put that aside now and sort of come back to the question about how to think about the questions that we want to ask, and whether anyone has any comments on the applications that they looked at that they want to discuss here. And perhaps what I should do is bring up the questions, the draft questions, and see whether in looking at the material, you have other thoughts or comments about these applications that you want to share with the others on the committee, or that would change the questions that we're thinking about asking of the committee, of the applicants. Does that make sense as a next step?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay,
Do we want to focus on one architectural firm at a time with questions, or just general questions?
Well, I think I would like to just sort of take the three one at a time and say questions, comments, thoughts on these, because there may need to be some questions that are phrased for them as individual firms. So why don't I pull the questions up, and then I'm going to look for hands to see if people have questions. Why don't we start with Flansburgh? Let me see if I can.
Here, how about I do a screen share, Margaret, and I'll take notes real time to switch it on the Google Doc that everyone has access to.
Okay, that would be great, because then I can keep an eye on the folks I see on the screen. So
Perfect.
Mr. Lugold's unmuted and ready to go, so he can go first when you're ready, Margaret.
Okay. Mr. Lubold, thoughts?
Well, I mean, they're all qualified. Looking
Totally.
through all of the material they've submitted. So I was just going to say, I feel, let them talk about their qualifications if there's a few questions. But I think the key is to drill down on the programming part and how their design is going to fit, the program here in Holyoke. They've all mentioned about switching from, natural gas to, air source heat pumps. So they're fully capable to be able to handle that, and I really feel that's the biggest question is, do they actually fit the programming that we're trying to give our kids to be able to provide the education that, everybody put together during the programming. That was my only thought on that, really.
Mm-hmm. And did you have any comments on any of the three firms that you wanted to share with the group?
I think they all fit the site. They all did a damn good job, and I was kind of shocked, really. If you look through the proposals and some of the, initial site plan that they've that they've done, they definitely seems like they can make it fit and make it happen.
Mhm.
And so to me, it really just became, does one design more efficiently and effectively deliver the programming that we're trying to do as a community?
Mhm.
And that is beyond my certain expertise. That's I think to more the professional educators that we have here on the team to be able to answer those questions. And you were there yourself through that whole thing and maybe know quite a bit when it comes time to really asking some of those type of questions.
I think it's a really poignant question too, because it will help us know how much they are considering our educational plan in their adaptation. Slashing.
I'm going to just be like super vulnerable and say that I think I'm kind of a smart person. And it was really hard for me to vet and look through those applications. There was a lot of verbiage that I'm not familiar with. And it was humbling and hard for me to come to this meeting with thoughts. So I appreciate Mark in saying, like, I know education and I know educational programming and I know how facilities support that, but I had a hard time like looking at that and sometimes making sense of a lot of it. So I just want to put that out there.
Listen, I think that's a very common experience. Do you go by Jackie or Jacqueline?
I'm Jackie.
Jackie. I think that's a very common experience, and I appreciate you being upfront about it. It's honestly a little bit easier when it's presented by individuals than when you have to read it. Architects are sort of notorious for their use of terms that are meaningless to the general public. Erin, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, since I know we're trying to like get down on the questions, like what I'm hearing is like affirmation from Mark that this first question's a good one. So I'm going to put it in green so that we can make sure we get to these questions.
Yep.
And I definitely had to Google terms, even ones that I heard before. DDB or whatever. CRM.
When I was going through, I like, like in most things, different people focus on different things. So I kind of honed in on what it was that they were taking away from their current building to make it fit. Because for example, the first one, the building is too big for what we need, right? So I found it interesting to read like what they were taking away, what spaces they were taking away, and so it'd be interesting to, like Mark said, hear how what they settled on fits what we need. I feel like programming can be fit into a building, sure, but we want to ensure that the building is really going to benefit us for the long haul. And if having a theater room, as an example, is something the district is dead set on, that, or like having like that community feel for our gymnasium to be used for other things, is dramatically reducing the size of the gymnasium really something that's going to fit for our community. So that's kind of what I was looking at when I looked through, was more of like what it was that they were reducing to kind of
some of that too was because they were the size for high school, so they're only reducing it to fit a middle school.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that,
you don't need a gym with the amount of bleachers in a middle school that you do in high school.
Right.
Yeah. Whitney?
Mr. Collmore.
Mr. Collmore.
Yes. Looking at some of these drawings here, I'm looking at the bathroom facilities. Why are they so far away from the classroom than we have in our own schools right today? Looking at these plans, they're too far away, and maybe there's not enough. But I'm just wondering why the bathrooms aren't closer to the students.
Mr. Collmore, are you looking, can you tell me whose application you're looking at? And, I have I can pull them up and we can look in a little more detail. I will say that depending on which one you're looking at, some of these are elementary schools and some of these are high schools. So, you know, in the high schools, there does tend to be, if what you're looking at is a high school, which I guess would be Flansburgh's, one of Flansburgh's is a high school. That's part of it. I will also say that generally today there are fewer dispersed bathrooms built in schools than certainly the era that I grew up in, and partly that's an oversight issue. The school district, the staff needs to be able to keep an eye on bathrooms, so they tend to be more fixtures co-located in certain locations that can be easily overseen. Ron, which plans are you looking at as an example? Because I have them all open, so I could pull something up.
Well,
I think it was a general oversight, in particular in his review.
A general observation, yeah.
right. Another thing I want to discuss is parking situations. Before we go any farther, I don't know about you, but anyone else, but I'm still thinking about angle parking on McIntosh Terrace next to the ball field. Is there any conflict there between Crozier Field and our school grounds?
So conflict in the sense that you would have parking that might be used by both, or needs to be designated for one for the school and not for Crozier Field. Is that what you mean by conflict?
Yes, I'm talking about utilizing McIntosh Terrace as a parking area for our schools. Also, that it could be also be used for our recreational programs at night on those fields.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Collmore, while I, absolutely respect your opinions on that, that's really a separate and city council issue. Because as you know, in order to take away any amount of footage of park grounds, you have to duplicate it tenfold. So it's really an issue that should be taken up with the city councilor of that ward and progress from there, because that's not school grounds. So that's not part of the project, but it's certainly something that, I think a lot of people would love to see happen. But I do believe that it's a separate issue that we'd have to start having those conversations with city councilors about, or maybe even the parks department, because it's parkland.
Yeah, I agree
This thing is completely different from Lynch School. Under Lynch School, it was an award to the city by people designating that this can only be used for park purposes. Crozier Field is a different situation. It was not designated by people as a park. It was just set aside for recreational purposes, to put in ball fields or put in tennis courts for the parks and recreation programs in the city of Holyoke. So it doesn't have any conflict whatsoever between Lynch and Crozier Field. If we're utilizing that field for any purpose at all, for education, for our students to go out onto that field for phys ed classes or whatever, that is perfectly all right. There's no conflict whatsoever about that. So I think that's one thing we should look at, rather than going out and we pick up 30 or 40 along McIntosh Terrace, then that frees up a lot of parking area around the school that we can use for other purposes.
Mayor Garcia, is Crozier Field considered a city park? And does it fall under the same jurisdiction as Anniversary Field, where you can't take parkland without duplicating it? Am I mistaken?
So yes, but I think
Sorry, I was
I
muted.
would say that this is a detail that is going to get to me. This is not a detail that is is going to help us differentiate between these designers. Erin, can I just steal the screen for a minute? I just want to explain to people the issue, and then I do think we should move on, just so people understand what it is that, what the issue is that Mr. Collmore is raising. So can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Did I share the right screen? So here is Peck, and here is this parkland. So this is all designated parkland. It can be used by the school. It can be used by anyone in the city. I think Mr. Collmore is thinking about this area here, McIntosh Terrace, and whether there could be additional parking here added that might reduce some of the need for building parking here. And I think it's a great question. I don't think it's a differentiator as far as this decision. So what I'd say is we'll put a pin in that. And when we have a designer selected, it's a question that can be discussed. And I do agree with Erin that it's very much a neighborhood issue.
Just one more thing, looking at these plans, the drop-off area for parents to be dropping off their children, is that an area that is under design, or is it still working? Because I think it's too close to the school where parents can just drive up and drop their children off and walk the distance into the school rather than being dropped off right at the front door of the school where there's going to be a lot of traffic congestion. I think we got to start thinking of, not just where the drop-off, well, we're thinking of where the drop-offs are, but the safety of the cars and the children going into the schools.
So again, I think it is a great point for the design process, and I'm making a note of some of these things. I would say that that is a piece of what we will do when one of the designers is on board, but it's an important point to come back to.
Thank you.
So other comments about, Erin, you want to pull the questions back up? So we talked about the importance of having them talk about the building program, which was a piece that we had a question and Mark's reiterated. Mr. Collmore has brought up the site, so I think that's an opportunity to have them present their thinking about it. There'll be quite different approaches because the buildings are so different. But again, this to me is an opportunity for us to see how different designers think about that issue of approaching the building. The other three big questions were about schedule. And I would say they all, well, not Jones Woodsett yet, but the two model schools folks both laid out a schedule that's in the proposal, but it's going to be easier to understand when they talk about it. They all addressed the fact that they recognize the fact that the building has to be all electric, but we want them to talk about in the interview, get into that in more detail and talk about what the building systems might look like. And then Erin had a great question about key challenges for the project and how you will approach them. So in looking at the applications, are there other questions that people thought needed to, these 5 questions, they will speak to in their initial presentation. So is there any other questions that seem like we want them to present about. So I see Mark's hands and I see Dave's. So Dave, why don't you
We'll
go
with Dave
next?
first? Yeah, thanks, Margaret.
Yeah, thanks. What we, we talked about how the design meets our educational, is adapted to our educational objectives. But I wonder if we should clarify. I mean, we've got it under the Q&A section, but how it also adapts to our community, our community engagement. If we wanted to get more specific about that.
That's a really interesting question.
How about up here, I just say, present your building plans and talk about how they'd be adapted to our educational plan, our community, and any new building requirements from the MSBA. Does that work, Dave, adding it up here? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I just, make sure we've kind of got it in there in the Q&A, but make sure they're addressing that, in the presentation.
Love it.
I think it's a really important question because, in the prior project, there were some unique program pieces that were around serving community members. So, and the proposed designs may have, the model school designs may have some of that, but it's hard to read without a presentation. All right, so Mark had his hand up and I say, Jessica?
Yeah,
Isaka.
just real quick. The Flansburgh proposals, both Kennedy and West Bridgewater had like square footage estimates in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe the Mount Vernon group did. Was that a requirement for their applications, or is that something they kind of submitted on their own? I guess this isn't a question, that I was just, I guess, moving ahead, and I shouldn't have, but.
I actually think it's a really interesting question. It wasn't specifically called out as something that was required, but I have been thinking that it would be good to ask them to submit some data. For instance, you all are not familiar with the document, but there's this kind of a big spreadsheet that is part of the MSBA process, where you have to write down how many classrooms you have and how many special ed classrooms you have and how many science labs you have and how big your gym is, and it's kind of very detailed. I don't think it would be appropriate to ask the designers to completely match theirs up, but I think getting a commitment that they can satisfy the program within a comparable square footage is important. And the reason is that it's the square footage that costs, that is the cost of a project. I mean, the way you shrink or grow a project is to add or delete square footage. So, for instance, a question would be, what is the average classroom size in your buildings that you are proposing? The average classroom size, for instance, in the Jones-Whitsitt design is about 950 square feet. So it's important to sort of have some data. So why don't I put together a little summary of those things and ask, and I think rather than ask them in the interview, why don't we ask them to bring something to the interview that summarizes some of those numbers? Because the square footage is such a big piece of the cost of it's the sort of core driver for the cost of the project.
Sure, and I just wanted to let Mr. Collmore know that in one of the submittals, the Mount Vernon group, they added considerable amount of parking to the north side of the site, which would kind of be between the school and the dingle. And it's closer to the school than some of the other parking further away. So that might alleviate some of those pain points that he was talking about.
Yep.
Okay, I've added this ahead of time. Okay.
All right, Isaka, honey, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So I had a question, and this wouldn't have occurred to me pre-COVID, but thinking about airflow, air filtration, and then I think thinking about the possibility of outdoor space to be used in classrooms. So heaven forbid we have another pandemic, but it might happen. And we know that schools had to close because we didn't have enough outdoor space. And I saw that, I think Flansburgh, the Bridgewater one, I think is the only one that I saw had like a designated outdoor classroom space. But just thinking about like, how are we thinking about this in a post-pandemic world, thinking about sort of what schools look like, and sort of thinking about, air filtration and the use of outdoor space for learning.
So again, that's a great question. What I would suggest doing is holding it for the Q&A, and perhaps you would be the person to ask it in the interview process. I think you're going to get a more satisfactory answer out of having an open dialogue about it than having them present something to you. So let Erin and I think about how to phrase a question.
I'll just do it live and you can approve it.
Okay, perfect. Phrase a question, and then Iska, if you could be the one to bring it up in Q&A, that would be great.
So does anybody else have any specific questions that they don't see on our list that they feel we need to ask, or any adaptations to the questions you have, or any other thoughts or concerns? Yes, Camila, please go for it.
Camila, puede hablar. Yo le traduzco. I'm gonna interpret
Mi pregunta es, yo hablé con mi hija, ella estudia en la escuela, y lo más que ella sí se me ha comentado que le molesta es que cuando el bus la recoge y la lleva a la escuela, ella tiene que esperar afuera por bastante tiempo en lo que abre la escuela, y pasa mucho frío cuando es invierno. Si hay una solución que se pueda hacer en esa parte con la arquitectura, pues sería favorable para ellos, porque ellos tienen que esperar afuera con el frío por mucho tiempo en lo que abre la escuela.
I'm going to ask the interpreter is going to ask a clarifying question, and then I'm going to interpret in English. So, Camila, ¿qué dijo de la arquitectura?
Lynette, it's super hard to hear you.
¿Qué dijo de la arquitectura?
¿Sí se escuchó?
Estoy aquí. ¿Qué dijo de la arquitectura?
Estamos esperando para el interpreter.
So Camila's question is, she has a daughter in a middle school, and one of the greatest concerns that her daughter usually tells her is about the amount of time that she has to wait outside sometimes to get into the building. And sometimes in the weekend. She's asking if there's some architecture thinking about that when they are dropped off in school.
We lost you.
I finished the question.
I think I got the nugget of it. Lynette, it sounds like Camilla's daughter is having to wait outside before getting into the building. I don't know. Erin, do you know why that might be?
Yeah, we've set up better rules this year for like the earliest a bus can arrive at the school, and more teachers are on duty more quickly to welcome students in. So if it is a problem this school year, I would encourage Camilla to talk to the school principal.
What about, I think Jackie might have something.
I was just going to say, to Erin's point, sometimes if the doors aren't open and it's before 7:30, kids would wait. And if they get dropped off early, if they don't take a bus. So sometimes, kids arrive really early because they just walk and they want to come. And so there is nowhere to stand. It makes me think about a design structure that might have an overhang where outside kids can wait under shelter. But currently at many schools, we don't have that. So if it's raining and they get dropped off early, they're standing in the rain until the door opens.
Well, kind of like what we have at Sullivan or Hoyoke High or
Yeah,
McMahon, where it
exactly.
has that overhang, keeps people
Yeah.
out of the elements.
Yep.
So, gracia, Camelia. I think that that's a great comment. Again, I'm going to sort of put it in what I would call the parking lot for engagement with the designer, but it is a free common feature. In fact, I wonder, I'm not going to take time now, but Camelia may have not been able to look at the designs. I think actually the Jones Whitsett design does have a protected place, but it can be something that's requested out of any of the designers for a particular site. So thank you. Looking for more raised hands. Whitney.
Yep, Whitney.
Hello, everybody. Margaret and everybody, the question I think that we posed, and maybe it's in the body of some of the notation so far, but what for Flansburgh and Mount Vernon, what type of adaptation do their current designs, which may have experienced code changes for the building department since their inception, what provisions, how much effort is needed to be made there? I think the other thing, just more of a general consideration, and it gets back to where Aaron Linville was initially talking about the model program. And I think I still have a disconnect in my mind because I currently see this as just a generalized RFP. I don't see where the coordination of the MSBA bringing this forward in regards to a representation of a design that would be able to be adapted easily. I mean, if these infrastructures need to be modified from a representation of what their initial incarnation was, then that's a complete redesign. If their mechanical functionality need to be redesigned because of a lack of fossil fuels to run the building, which was previously utilized, then that's a complete redesign of the HVAC system. So in essence, the whole representation, aside from expediency, is the fact that there was a 4.75% cap for services in regards to remuneration to the design firm. Now, I think that if you're really going to look at the benefit for the city, and if we still can experience some time savings in, maybe a quarter or 4 or 5, who knows how many months, then that's great. With the escalation rate now, every month is, another percentage point, if you will. So, but if that's offset by an increase above that base rate of which the program stipulates, I still don't see that delta's been recognized. Perhaps maybe I just haven't read it. But then therefore, how much we're going to end up paying for all these changes to their designs. So there's really nothing that's so much of an adaptive notion of something that worked because of the lapse of time and the constraints that our particular community has. So that's a long question, but I suppose it could come down to code adaptability, and is the 10th edition coming out in January going to make any more restrictive changes, even still to Jones Whitsett as well? So can you summarize that for me, Margaret?
Hey, Whitney, I personally think it's in this part of the question. Present your building plans and talk about how they would be adapted to our ed plan, our community, and any new building requirements from the MSBA since your model school was approved.
Yeah, well, the MSBA's dictates does require adherence to the building code, so I think generically that might cover it. But the MSBA does not have any jurisdiction over the building code. It's more the fact that their buildings comply with it. I hear you.
Well, did I not word it correctly then?
No, I mean, again, the MSBA is the funding authority that requires building code adherence. They won't give you any money unless the architect or the engineer stamps the drawing to state that it's in compliant at a moment in time. So no, it's fine, but I think
I'll take away from the MSBA. And then I think the other part is your schedule gets to that, and we can ask more questions maybe in
Yeah.
the Q&A, like how extensive do you feel like the modifications are?
Yeah.
How big of a lift or something?
Well, do
If we
we
don't
have a
get it.
conversation about the base rate?
Yeah.
Because that's really that's the selling feature here.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think after we get through comments, I did a sample calculation on this, how the fees are likely to land that I want to walk you through. I don't. My big takeaway from it is that although there may be some schedule savings with a model school, I think there's not a significant savings in fees. The fees the community will pay, and it's a little bit of a complicated, because the way, as Whitney is saying, the way the fees are capped by the MSBA for what's called a core program, Jones Whitsett's design, and the model schools is different. But I found that actually, if you ran the numbers and made some base assumptions, they seem to be where you land is pretty similar. So I'm happy to kind of get into that in a little detail. The big takeaway for you all is I would not be focused on the notion that there is a significant savings in fees here, because the savings, if there is a savings, is probably not small. And going back to my diagram, it's rather a small piece of the overall project. So happy to, I'm sure there's some folks who really want to see the detail of that, but probably not everyone. So I want to wait till the end and make sure we get everybody's comments. Whitney, I want to encourage you to be completely nudgy about this in the interview. Like, if they don't address this in what they present, ask them a question in the Q&A, say, tell me more about that. We want to hear more about that.
I think the other thing I heard, and just to segue for a brief minute, if you guys can bear with me, I talked to David Fontaine probably 4 or 5 months ago, who was his company was the selected, this was Junior, the selected construction management at risk, which was a different type of a procurement vehicle that we chose to utilize before. I'm not suggesting that now, but he had said sometimes with the model schools, of which their company had built numerous ones. Now you get a very, from his opinion, not much of a latitude in regards to the interior finishes and some of the build out that is prescribed into that original creation. So in other words, if you wanted VCT instead of terrazzo, and I guess that would be another question too as well, Margaret. How tied in are we to the interior finishes and some of the specifics that can really drive the square footage costs?
Right. Well, the bottom line is you're not tied into anything. What it does mean is that every change you make from the model school is design time and design cost. And that's the trade-off. So again, if you're in a gigantic rush to build a building and time is your primary driver, the model school process has a lot to offer. If you want to be able to look into and sort of unpack what's in the building and reprogram or, change finishes or whatever, that's a cost for them to revise their documents.
Well, and again, I can appreciate that, but I'm going to suggest that the time can be a little bit flexible, but the dollars are going to decide the viability of the project.
Yep, I agree about that. So there are lots of folks who haven't spoken up yet. Who has a question that they have been hesitating to ask?
Remember, most processes, there's no wrong question, no bad question, because this is.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, if you could maybe put that the list of the questions back up, and it might spark some ideas or thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, again, we have already gone over them too, so
yeah,
just genuinely might not. So.
Well, and Deborah, did you have a question?
Not really a question. I don't think this is a question to add to our list of questions, but just an observation about this process because I feel like we're doing this for our due diligence, right? For the state. The state wants us to look at model schools to see if we could find something better than the design we already really liked. I personally really liked the Jones Winset design. And when I looked at it again, when I compared it to the others, I got that happy feeling. I remember, you know, all the community meetings and how much I liked it then. I still like it now. But I do want to do our due diligence and compare. But I just feel like the model school, if it's not going to save us that much money, and if it's not going to save us that much time because of all of the changes that we have to make it fit into the PEC site, it just doesn't seem like we're getting that much by choosing a model school. It seems like we have to make a lot of sacrifices to choose a model school because we don't have as much decision making on the interior. That adds more cost and more time. Where it feels like with the Jones Whitsett design, we have more flexibility and more say.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's just an illusion. I'm not sure. So not a question. I was just milling this over as we're talking through.
Well, I mean, it's not exactly an illusion in the sense that I think this building committee is likely to feel more ownership of being able to move through the design development process with a designer doing it together. Whereas in the situation of the model school, you're basically looking at what they've already designed and sort of looking at how you want to change it. It's sort of a different mindset. In one, you are working together towards a goal, and the other, you're taking something that exists and modifying it to suit you. It's almost like the difference between designing, you know, a house for yourself or decorating an apartment for yourself versus moving into an apartment and then modifying it to suit yourself. I mean, it's sort of, the process is similar, but it will feel different. It would feel different. It's, again, I think not necessarily a reason to choose one or the other, but it is, you're putting your finger on a real difference.
Thank you, Margaret.
I see Jamie's hand up and I see Mark's hand up again. So Jamie?
Sorry about my video too. Can everybody hear me or no?
Yes.
Okay, you can hear me. I'm Josh, I'm across the hall, but I don't have any video.
Oh, you're here.
Anyways, this isn't a question for the designers, more for the group and funding, maybe for you, Margaret. So if we go with the Jones Whitsett design versus one of the other ones that's going to be a model school design, will MSBA still give us the same funding for whatever design we move forward with?
Now I'm going to pull up my slide because and
This
again,
is a good segue for you.
Yeah. So this is where I was headed with what I showed earlier. So I'm just going to quickly, I'm going to go back to the beginning of these slides just to recap. But we'll get to the end slide. So can everybody see this? Actually, I haven't got it in slideshow view. Hello. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
So this is that slide I started with, which is explaining the piece we're talking about here are the design fees, which are 8% of the total project cost on average. Okay. This piece we looked at, so of that 8%, let's call it 4% is the architect and 4% is all the other folks who need to do work to create a completed design. This is an explanation of a complicated topic, which is that if you go with the Jones Whitsett design, you are part of what is called the MSBA's core program, and they have a certain way of approaching the caps and when I say cap, they cap how much they will pay of certain components of the project. The biggest one, the one that has the biggest impact, is that they cap how much they will pay of construction on a cost per square foot basis. And I'm actually gonna toggle, where is it? I'm gonna toggle to a different image. Whoop, that wasn't very smart. Okay, I'm gonna take this down for a minute, and I'm gonna use a chart from the MSBA's website to explain this. And I can't remember if we looked at this before, but this is really interesting if you're a construction geek. Construction cost info that's on the MSBA website. And, you know, in a nutshell, every one of these little orange boxes is a project, and if you hover over them, actually, can you guys see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you hover over them, each of them's a project. And there's a couple of really important lines here. So this orange line that goes up through this is the MSBA looking at the average cost for new construction. And the last time they looked at it was December 31st, 2020, when they looked back over the previous year's projects. And at that point, the average cost was $493. I think I've actually maybe used the wrong number in my calculation. Yeah. What is it? 493. So interestingly, shortly after that, can you see these little X's here? These little X's are the Holyoke project. So shortly after they did that calculation, within 6 months of that, the two Holyoke projects were approved. And the Peck project was approved at $522 a square foot. And the Lawrence School was at $478. The difference is the demolition costs of Peck. Okay. So that's sort of important to know that those two projects were sort of right in line with where the average was at the time. Down here at the bottom, there's a green line that shows how much the MSBA is reimbursing. And you can see that back at the beginning of the process, they were like right in the middle of all the projects. Over time, the orange line and the green line have grown further apart. So now, as of today, if we were in front of the MSBA, they just had a meeting last week, but let's say for the next meeting, I think is in January. Their cap is at 360. So basically, the way to think about this is if the average cost of the project, and these projects were very cost competitive before, as you can see, it was 493 and 360. There's a difference of about a little over a third in what they're going to pay for and what you need to pay for. And right at the moment, they are tying their reimbursement on designer fees to that percentage. So unfortunately, just to take this down, when I did my calculation earlier today, I used the wrong number, but I think it's still useful to look at as a marker. There we go. Can you see that? So, in a nugget, here's the 360. Here is the cost of a square foot of construction, right? So I used 478. It's actually 493. But if you use 493 as a marker, and the MSBA pays for 360 of that, that's approximately, it's a little less than that actually. 70% is being paid by the MSBA, 30% is being paid by the city. That is now how they reimburse on the designer fees as well in the core program. Now, just to make it wicked complicated, on the model schools, they cap their reimbursement at 4.75% of construction. So they use a totally different method of determining how much they will pay of the fees. So what
benefits us?
Sorry?
Which one benefits us?
Well, that was what I was curious about. I wanted to look and see, what I've never been through a designer process like this. So, great question. If I can just get the slide changed. So what I did here is I tried to look at a very high level at what the difference is. And in a nutshell, it's important to remember that the big things that need to be modified in the design are programming, Mark's point, site design, Ron's point, building envelope updated to meet the energy code, and building systems designed to be resumed all electric, Whitney's point, right? And then I looked at the fees, and I calculated these. So this calculation is looking at what the fees would be if we just had the sort of same numbers and percentages and cost as we did for PEC, right? And what I got to was that the overall fees for the designer, not including feasibility, because feasibility is behind us, right? But the overall fees for the designer would be in the neighborhood of 5.4 million, of which the MSBA would pay 70% and the community would pay 30%. Then I looked at the model school and I said, well, what's different? So in the schematic design phase, there's more work to do. So I said, well, let's take this number and make it 25% more. There's less work to do in design development. So I said, let's guess it's 50% less. So I halved that number. And for construction documents, I said, let's say it's 25% less. I mean, I'm estimating, right? This is just a kind of crude way of getting at it. The bidding and construction numbers are the same because we're talking about the same construction value. So when you do the math on all of that and you look at what the MSBA is paying versus what the community is paying, it looks to me like the number is actually very close. So in the core program for a project of this size, I believe it's sort of in this neighborhood. Again, this is the old project. It's not the new project 5 years later with escalation, right? But it's representative. So I think it would be in this neighborhood. And then in the model school, it would be approximately the same. So, back to what I was saying at the beginning, the reason to choose the model school is that if you see something in one of the model schools that you think is exactly what you need and is better than the other applicants, or if the overall schedule matters to you in a really critical way. I don't think, based on this very crude, but I think correct analysis, actually because I used the wrong number, I think this difference is probably a little higher. But again, if you think about this, it sounds like a lot of money, but what we're really saying is here, it's less than $100,000 in a $70 million project, right?
The short of it is focus on what's best for our community because there's no significant savings for the model school.
That was my takeaway doing this analysis today.
Okay, Jamie, does that answer your question thoroughly?
Yes, it does. I just wanted to know, like, if it was substantial savings,
Right.
Going with a model school, I think that's something to consider, obviously, for everybody.
Absolutely.
But if it's, neck and neck, then obviously, again, it's best fit for community. I agree 100%.
Okay, Mr. Lubel, did you have a specific question? We are getting along on time, so I just want people to start to be conscious of that.
Yeah, I know it's kind of been screwy the way the MSBA has us doing, looking at the model schools. And we also have that design that we already have in front of us. But is there any criteria that we have to present to justify besides just, well, we think this one's better for our
Yeah.
community? You know, if the model schools comes in and proves that their classroom sizes and everything else satisfies it, does the MSBA say, well, you have to go with the model schools then? Or, you know, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here, and I don't know if they provided any guidance as a, you know, to
So-
justify.
So it's a really important and great question. They have been very clear with me and with Whitney and Aaron in our kickoff meeting that they consider, and I think the mayor was there as well, it is solely the decision of this committee. They are not going to weigh in. However, we need to provide a narrative that supports the reasons.
Right.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I just wanted to see
They
where
weren't.
we were in the whole thing.
It
Make
wasn't
sure
at
we
all
do
that-
it right is what I guess I'm trying to get at.
No,
Yeah.
you're on the money, Mark. It wasn't at all that they wanted us to go the model school direction. It was to explore it and make sure that, you know, we're comfortable with the direction we're going to, and that there can potentially be a savings because of what's happened in other communities. But obviously today, circumstances have changed so many levels, you know, that didn't exist before. To your earlier points, Mark, when we first started talking about this, when you were talking about the geographic, you know, the land and how it is and how it's not just flat, it's makes it a little more complicated. But yeah, if we can get our narrative together, you know, again, we want to make sure that no stone went unturned.
Yeah.
And say, hey, we explored this. This is what we learned, and this is the reason why we're going in X direction. And we've satisfied that. And no one can ever say, well, why didn't you explore model schools? We could have probably saved money. You know what I mean? They can never say that because we did, and this is what we learned. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's just such an odd predicament. You know, I don't want, you know, a firm getting upset, and then before you know, they're suing the MSBA because their program satisfies everything. You know, I just want to make sure we just have everything down exactly how we need to do it.
Well, I mean, let me just say that I think the model school designers have participated in these processes before. What they want is a fair opportunity to present their design. And I think we need to make like saying, well, I like that one and I don't like that one is not good. Saying,
Right.
I think this is a better fit with our program. I think this fits the site better. I think this has a better fit with our community needs. You know, we're going to want to construct the sort of concrete reasons that if you were talking to someone in the community and they said, well, why'd you pick this one? You would want to say, well, you know, like, here's my 5 reasons. So I see Peter's hand is up.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, and this is a great discussion and learning about everything. And I think one of the biggest things we have to take away from this is the financing of the project. You know, with the council to get through this. My concern is the gap, you know, between what it is per square foot right now, the average cost, and the 360 that the MSBA is. Is there any way, with depending on who we pick, with the designer, is there any way that number could come down a little bit, or the MSBA could come up a little bit? Because that's I think where it's going to be a really big tough sell on the financial side of it.
Yeah,
I don't think there's any hope that the MSBA is going to come up. I think we've kind of explored that avenue and
Right.
just have to focus on the number that they are paying instead of the number that they're not paying. I don't know if Margaret, you have any thoughts on how to get the design numbers down, but
well, I think that each of the designers is going to talk about what they think are the cost savings opportunities, because that's embedded in this. But Peter, there's no, the gap issue is independent of the designers. I know that the MSBA is talking about potentially raising the cap because it was mentioned at the end of the last board meeting. And because there's been such significant increase in construction costs, going back to that diagram with the orange line sort of shooting off into space, I'm sure they will revisit it. I can't predict what they'll do. So it is possible that that gap will get smaller. I don't see a way in which it will go away.
Right. Again, and because as I said, I know we talked with our legislative leaders in Boston and trying to say we're one of maybe 3 or 4 communities with the receiver, and trying to make a special, thought saying that this is what we're at in Holyoke, and with our community is there a way, because we're under receivership, that the state or MSBA or and I know that's a tough sell, but I know our leaders are trying to do something, but it's just a big thing, and I think it's going to be a tough. Even though last time it was a totally, with the 2 schools and being on the ballot, this is trying to look at with the council and with the mayor, what does our budget look like in the next, 10 to 20 years, and that's the thing. Sometimes it's hard to project out that far, but we got to be able to make sure that we can afford this for the next, 20, 25 years.
No question. I mean, the guidance I would give this committee for the upcoming activity of picking a designer is I would put the frame on it that Peter is putting on this, which is who seems like the firm that is best set up to give us the best value project that's going to, as well as being able to sort of talk about it publicly and, gather support.
Thank you, Margaret.
I just have thoughts on that though, Peter, and only just because we can't keep going around the merry-go-round with the same argument that, as much as we'd all love to try to get the MSBA to contribute more, it's just not possible. So just I don't want to say we shouldn't talk about it, but it's just we should try to change the narrative and change the focus of the conversation so that way people aren't, I don't want to use the word harping, but aren't over focusing on something that ultimately we can't change. Because, yes, we're in receivership. Unfortunately, though, receivership and the MSBA funding mechanisms are just 2 different things. So whether or not there's some kind of legislation or petitioning we can do within our representation to try to just get some kind of funding from the state that's not related to the MSBA to help offset the project, then that would be amazing. But the reimbursement rate is, unfortunately just what it is. So, maybe just try to change the narrative and change the conversation so that way that's not the point of contention, because we have to look at it as the fact that they're willing to give us what they're willing to give us. Because once we close PEC, which is happening next fall, when and if we ever need to bring that school back online, it's going to be on the city's dime, 100% to bring that building up to code. So that's something that as a city councilor, you can help reiterate to other city councilors, because if we don't get, we're closing PEC in the fall. So if we don't get this approved next year, PEC is going to have to reopen. We're going to need the space. That's our plan. So the city is going to be 100%. MSBA is not going to give us a cent. And as you know, once you close the building, to reopen it, now you're bringing everything up to today's code. So that project will be 100% on the city's dime if that ends up happening. So, we have to look at this money as a blessing. And, yes, ultimately, of course, the city has to be able to afford it. But what are our options not to? And then the opponents last time around, they wanted a 1-school option. They wanted an option that could fit within the city budget. And here we are doing our due diligence to try to bring that exact option. So if we just argue the same point, well, we should deserve more from the MSBA. Well, so does every other community that's under hardship and a gateway city and a struggling community, right? So we just have to find a way to healthily change the narrative and change the conversation away from what we can't control.
I agree. I agree totally. I think we have to get the community to see that the cost would be if you did close Peck and we didn't build a new school. And the city in the past few years, we had the Lynch School that would have cost us 1.5 million that we sold that property. They took care of that cold vest. We had the geriatrics, which would have cost the city over $1 million to take down. And now we got a beautiful project that's going in there that they paid the cost. So it's important that we change it and we get that narrative. And I'm just looking at as my colleagues and what they're going to be thinking and what talking about, because it's not an easy sell. And we got to get on the right message. We got to get the right messaging and we got to get to a point where we can do this and move forward with it, because I don't think there's any second chances after this time. I mean, this is our second chance and that's it. So I agree with you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Yos?
Yeah, since we brought up the topic of finance, I didn't want to start a whole new discussion on that, but I did have a little concern. I was looking at the city website, and it's requesting proposal for the ARPA, revenue replacement funds. I think due a week from Friday. Or 2 weeks from Friday? Are we looking at that same deadline for, if we were looking to use ARPA funds for this? Maybe Joshua could speak to that.
Yeah, Aaron had inquired about it earlier today.
We talked about this on the phone today for half an hour.
And certainly do encourage, maybe you can do it through Soto and the school department, that it's a statement of interest. We're asking people to submit, so it allows us to understand what some of the desires are, and we can work with people to see if whether or not it's eligible or if they need to. It's like the opportunity. It's the opportunity to submit an LOI before actually submitting an application. And I'd encourage the group to apply for a dollar amount. What that dollar amount is, I don't know. And mind you, I'm sure we have way more requests than we do have money, but definitely submit. Even if you get 100,000 or 500,000, it's pennies, but it's something.
So, Mr. Yost, my thought was to discuss this with Mr. Soto tomorrow, because I knew he wasn't going to be on the meeting today. He's at the MASC conference, and I'll be there tomorrow. And then I'm happy to follow up with you on that if you'd like to help us write a statement of interest and decide how to move forward with it.
And we are working on some angles, none of which I want to talk about now, because there's so much. It's a puzzle. But soon we'll be talking about it. And who was it that mentioned it? Was it Peter? Soon with the council, with the conclusion of the financial forecasting model, looking out a couple of years, that's going to be wrapping up soon, and we'll be having that conversation with Andrea, the hired consultant who drafted that. So hopefully that'll help you guys out. But there are some opportunities we're looking at to try to defray our borrowing costs as much as possible. There isn't a day that goes by when we don't think and look at this. So.
Thanks, Mayor Garcia. Mr. Yost, if you're all set, I'm going to move on to Mr. Lubo's question and then turn it back over to Margaret.
Yeah, just so maybe we could get in touch after you and Anthony Soto talk, Aaron, and we can at least get that statement in.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I know that there were some items that weren't included in the reimbursement, some site work items that maybe that would be the place to look to spend ARPA funds around some site work issues that weren't covered as part of the reimbursement formula from the state. Off the top of my head, can't remember, but I knew that there or remember that there were some in the original proposal for rerouting some streets or coming in off the parking lot from the Hoyok High School up to Peck School. I think some of those items weren't kind of reimbursable. So
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two things to think about. One is that anything that's off-site, which is related to the project, is not reimbursable, but there may be things that you need, right? The other is that the MSBA caps its contribution to site costs at 8% of construction. It's rather unusual unless the site, we've had one project that was a site in Chelsea where the building took up the whole site, where that number was 8% or below. So typically it's higher. And that's, so it's also, there's a possibility of carving out certain pieces that can be done as a separate like a playground installation might be an example, right? Of something you could potentially fund with ARPA money and do as a separate project after the fact.
Right, I see. So there might be opportunity there. That's all.
Anybody have any specific thoughts on the ARPA? Feel free to email me. Like I said, I'm going to briefly discuss it with Anthony tomorrow, and then I'll reconnect with people early next week with their thoughts, and we'll kind of go from there.
Aaron, I have a couple comments based on this. Just briefly, in regards to the discussion here that we've just had. Number one, with the mothballing, if you will, for the proposed timeline for Peck School, I would ask that we would seek a rendering from the solicitor and the building department regarding the grandfather status of the Peck School should we decide to close it for a indefinite amount of time, say a couple of years, or during the duration. If we get a building, if we do not get a building, we're looking at going back in there. Now, one of the iterations from the original feasibility study was to look at renovating the Peck School to today's standards, and that was more expensive than building a new school. So we'd want to make sure that I can keep up with our inspections for our elevators, our fire life safety systems, and all of the other components there that are legislated by officials of jurisdiction. So if this doesn't shake out, we can move back in there and not have to renovate this entire structure. That would be unfeasible. That's one thing. So I think we need a rendering in that regard. The second thing is an observation in general regarding this mechanism of which the MSBA is utilizing now. It's a procurement vehicle. It's like an RFP, but it's already pre-vetted by them, and consequently, they have supplied us with contacts, Flansburgh and Mount Vernon, that they feel are viable in regards to allowing them to proceed with an engagement and then reimbursement. Now, Jones-Whitsitt is not part of that model schools program, so consequently, this is kind of a hybrid procurement. Now, in that regard, I do know that there was a communication sent to the solicitor's office for the city to explain in regards to their reasoning in why we believe we can perpetuate and transfer the original RFP procurement for Jones-Whitsitt to this second iteration. Margaret, do we have any information? I know we've supplied some information to them. I had an outreach from Assistant City Solicitor Bissonette, but we need to shake this down right away to make sure that they're going to view Jones-Whitsitt as actually a viable partner, even though they allowed us to engage them in this process.
So I believe when you have looked at that correspondence, I really believe they're just looking for documentation that the city looked at this as it did, and that they have something in their file. And I believe Lori Belanger did some of this work before she left, and I think it just never made it back to the MSBA. So I'm on it.
Good. I would obviously feel more comfortable for the especially for the building committee's edification, that we would have something in writing saying that they accept that rationale.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. Okay, how's everybody feeling right now? We're, we projected an hour. We're at an hour and a half. That's okay. We're doing important work here. But did anybody have any other thoughts on the questions that we want to be interviewing on? If not, then we'll move on to approving the minutes from the last meeting.
Yeah, Aaron.
Yes, Mr. Collmore.
Yeah, is anyone giving any thought of thinking of ways that we can save? For example, on the demolition of that building, if we can save on that demolition of that building, we can put it into something that we really, really want in the building itself. So I think we ought to start thinking of ways that we can start reducing the cost of that building by making suggestions.
So, agreed. The cost of the demolition that was estimated as part of the previous project was fairly high because of some material that was included in the concrete foundation, but I think we could do more diligence on that. And I don't honestly have a good sense whether demolition costs have escalated in parallel. So I think that the very first thing, once the designer is on board, the very first thing to take up is going to be looking for ways to reduce costs, and that would be a good one to reevaluate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collmore. All right, do we need to finalize interview questions and overview expectations for November 17th, sorry? Or is that basically kind of one and the same of what we just did?
I think maybe Aaron could just pull it up one more time and we could finalize it. What will happen is I will take the top questions and send them out to designers with directions about the to make a presentation. The other
where are they doing their presentation from?
So we have said it was going to be on Zoom.
Okay.
It'll be a Zoom presentation. And we do also need to decide about the order in which we want to have them interview. I could argue this either way. I mean, I think there's some value to having a presentation from Jones Whitsett and then getting to compare the others to it. But it may also be better to have the presentations of the model school designers and have Jones Whitsett at the end. Does anybody have any thoughts about who they'd like to hear from first?
So is Flansburgh going to present both at the same time, or are they going to do one and then the other?
So I made a note. I was a little surprised, to be honest, that we got two. And I spoke to Kent Kovacs, who's the principal in charge, and I strongly recommended to him, since he only was going to have an hour for his interview, that he could take. I think he feels one of them is a much better fit than the other, but he was deferential to the fact that the MSBA had listed both. So he will come and say, we have these two. We think this one is the better one. Here's why.
Thank you.
I see Peter and Dave both have questions.
Jamie.
And Jamie.
Yeah, I think Peter was first. So, Mr. Tallman?
Yeah, no question. I just said the order, and I understand what her thoughts are, but I think I'd like to hear from the other two first, the model schools. That's just my opinion. And then Jones Whitten at the end.
Yep.
Thanks, Peter.
Yep.
Jamie?
I'm in agreement with Peter, only because I feel like Jones Whitsett is clearly the favorite. And when they reintroduce, and everyone's going to fall in love with it all over again, and they might not give the attention to the other ones, because everybody's mind is made up. So maybe saving it for last, maybe after seeing the other designs, and we'll reiterate why everybody loved the other one or not. I just feel like maybe the one that everyone already is familiar with, go with it last. It's just my opinion.
Yep. I see Peter. I see Dave.
We're on to Mr. Yost.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm going to vote the same as Pete and Jamie just did, for the same
Okay.
reason.
Let's do it that way.
All right. Thanks for your commentary on that, guys.
Margaret, sorry, real quick, why did you think the other way to view Jones Whitsett first? What was your ideology around it as to, I'm just wondering.
I feel like it's understanding what it is you're comparing the thing to might be easier, but to be honest, I think that's why I put together the package of the material that they had submitted previously, recognizing, as Jackie said earlier, some of it is gobbledygook. But I think what I would suggest is that you spend some time looking at the Jones Whitsett's material, which I included in the link that we sent out. If you have any questions about what you're looking at, call me, email me. Let me help you sort of understand if you have questions what you're looking at, and then let's have Jones Whitsett at the end.
Great, thank you.
All right, guys, if no one else has anything else to add to that particular conversation, we're going to move on to approving the minutes from the last meeting.
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Mr. Tallman. On discussion, does anybody have any thoughts or concerns about the minutes? Seeing none, all those who vote to approve the minutes, you can raise your actual hand or your virtual hand. Sorry, I make myself laugh. Thanks, everyone. Please put your virtual and real hands down. All right, cool. Anybody oppose approval of the minutes? Seeing none, I will say that unanimously passed. Thank you kindly. Checking on actions from the last meeting. Anthony is not here. So we can't get an update from him on whether or not students from the student councils will be joining us at some point. So just a reminder, guys, our next meeting is Thursday, November 17th. It is our interviews. That meeting is starting at 5, not at 6. Please all try to be well prepared, have your notepads, have your questions printed out, be ready, be on the meeting 5 minutes ahead of time, all of that fun stuff. Miss Linville, I saw your hand up. Can feel free to interject.
Just a request to come early so that if we're starting right at 5, I would hate for us to be coming in late for that person.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll call the meeting to order and we'll try to get started with the first interview right at 5. So yeah, definitely please try to be signed on early by then. All right, anybody else have anything else that they want to discuss? Mr. Lubold?
Just real quick, now I know why Margaret wanted Jones Whitsett to go first, because if people couldn't make it for 5 o'clock, a lot of us already know their proposal. So that was why I believe we had recommended them going first. So
Is 5 o'clock a conflict with by show of hands? Does anybody know ahead of time that they can't be on by 5?
Might be a little late, but that's all right.
A valid reason to have the familiar one go first. No? Okay. All right. We don't need to vote on adjourning, so if no one else has anything that they need to discuss, I'll consider the meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.
All right, everybody.